This is Chapter 1, Part 5, the last part of this particular chapter. So what we're going to do in this unit is we're just going to be taking a look at body cavities, body plans, and those sorts of things. So first, the overall function of these body cavities is they serve to help protect the organs and permit changes in size of some of these organs. Provides enough room for them to change the size and to also move around somewhat while still being anchored. Later on, we'll be talking about the mesenteries and how they serve to anchor them in place. So these body cavities, as you will soon learn, there is a name, a classification for everything. So these body cavities are divided, and we're going to kind of go over these divisions. So what we have is we have a dorsal body cavity, which consists of, it is then subdivided into a cranial cavity for the brain and a vertebral cavity for the spinal cord. And then we have this ventral body cavity, and as you see, it is going to be subdivided. I'll just mention them now. This ventral body cavity will be divided into a thoracic and an abdominopelvic cavity. This thoracic cavity then gets subdivided for the heart and the lungs, and the abdominopelvic cavity gets subdivided into an abdominal cavity and a pelvic cavity. What we see with these ventral body cavities is that we have membranes here. In these body cavity membranes, we have two separate linings, even though it is continuous. So we have a parietal layer and a visceral layer. And in between these two layers, they are continuous with each other, but in between these two layers, there is going to be serous fluid. So parietal lines the walls of the cavity. Visceral covers the internal organs. So if we said that there was a parietal pleura or a visceral pleura. Parietal pleura, this pleura tells you what the cavity is, and pleura is dealing with the lungs. Visceral pleura would then be covering the lungs, okay? We are going to be covering this again and again and again as we go over the anatomy. We're going to be mentioning parietal and visceral. So they each have different names, but it follows what parietal is and what visceral is, okay? So just keep that in mind. And again, these two layers are continuous with each other. So here's the example that one author gives. You stick your hand in the balloon, this outer layer, it is all continuous, but in here, this would be the visceral, here would be the parietal, and in between is this serous fluid. All right, so we're going to go over one more example. All right, so surrounding the heart, we have a parietal pericardium, and then we have a visceral pericardium. The visceral pericardium tells you it's the heart. Visceral tells you it's right on the heart. Parietal pericardium tells you it's the heart. Parietal tells you it's lining the pericardial cavity. And in between the two, there's going to be serous fluid. And the amount of this serous fluid in here can cause some problems if it's too little or too much, and we'll get into that in 169. So now let's go over these body cavities and break down the subdivisions. As I've already mentioned, for the dorsal cavity, we have the cranial and the vertebral, and the ventral cavity has two major subdivisions, the thoracic and the abdominopelvic. We already said that the cranial houses the brain, the vertebral cavity houses the spinal cord. So that's really it for the dorsal. So we have the ventral cavity. Here are two major subdivisions, thoracic and abdominopelvic. The divider between these two is going to be the diaphragm. Okay, so we'll take a look at this thoracic, subdivide that. Take a look at this abdominopelvic, subdivide that. So the thoracic cavity is subdivided into the pleural cavities, pericardial cavity, and the mediastinum. All right. The pleural cavities house the lungs. The pericardial cavity houses the heart, and the mediastinum contains the pericardial cavity, as well as some remaining thoracic organs. And I believe I have an image that will kind of show that. I might go too far. Okay. So this pericardial cavity houses just the heart, but in between these pleural cavities, there's still this space right here. So the mediastinum really just consists of this pericardial cavity and the room that is just superior to the heart. Okay, so that's the difference between the mediastinum and the pericardial cavity. So now we have the abdominopelvic cavity, and as we said, it's separated from the thoracic by the diaphragm, and it's composed of two subdivisions, the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. Abdominal cavity contains stomach, intestines, spleen, liver, gallbladder, other organs, and the pelvic cavity contains the bladder, reproductive organs, and the rectum. You've already seen this image, but here it's labeled again. So here is our dorsal body cavity consisting of the cranial and the vertebral. Our ventral, which consists of the thoracic and abdominopelvic. What separates them is the diaphragm. Abdominopelvic is then subdivided into the abdominal and the pelvic. Thoracic is subdivided into the pleural, the mediastinum, and the pericardial cavity. So this is just showing a view into the pelvic cavity here and these abdominal organs here that are in the abdominal area. Just quickly want to mention that we do have some organs that are retroperitoneal, that they are, I think it's going to be highlighted. It is. Don't worry about this part. I'm not going to get into a coelom or a tube within a tube, but here is this parietal peritoneum. It's lining that cavity, and we do have some organs that are going to be considered retroperitoneal. The biggest one are going to be the kidneys, but the duodenum, pancreas, some parts of the colon. I'm actually going to back up again for a second. Here is the colon, here, and some parts of the ascending, some parts of the descending are also retroperitoneal. If the pancreas and kidneys are, the duodenum, which is the beginning of the small intestine, that is also retroperitoneal. So these are the cavities. I'm not too worried about you memorizing all of these. I just want you to realize that that is not a complete list of all of the body cavities. There are others. And so, like I said, I'm really not going to go over these. I'm not going to ask you about them. It's just that as we continue on, we are going to be talking about an oral cavity, a nasal cavity. When we get to joints, we're going to be talking about the synovial cavities. And I just don't want you guys to think that these are some sort of subdivisions of that dorsal and ventral. They are not. So these are separate cavities. So if you just understand that there are others besides what we just covered, that will be fine. All right, we're just going to end now with how we can divide up these abdominopelvic regions. There are two ways of doing it. So we have these abdominopelvic regions and we have quadrants. For the regions, there are going to be 9 of them. You do need to know these, and you need to know these in order. So a test question I could do is I could say, what is superior to the umbilical region? And you would have to know that it's the epigastric. What is superior to the right iliac region? You would have to know that it's the right lumbar region. And although I'm not going to test you on this, there are distinct anatomical lines that signify where these quadrants, where these regions are divided. Same with the quadrants. I'm not going to test you on them. Might be helpful for you moving forward. You're probably going to have to know them once you get into nursing. So those are the 9 abdominopelvic regions. The quadrants are much easier, right? We have an RUQ, LUQ, LLQ, RLQ. Right upper, right lower, left lower quadrants. Okay. So just make sure that you know quadrants and make sure that you know these abdominopelvic regions. I am not going to be testing you on where a particular organ lies in these abdominopelvic regions or quadrants for the simple reason that so many of them, if we take a look at the liver, go into both quadrants. Same with the stomach. Same with the small intestine. So I am not going to be doing that. Just introducing these. Later on, you will probably go over them in much greater depth. So that is the end of chapter 1.